Good morning or good afternoon, I suppose, depending on where in the world you find yourself right now. It is my pleasure to present to you today some work I have completed on matters of game ontology, on looking at the intersection of posthumanism and the philosophy of Kyoto School thinker Nishida Kitaro. Let's begin by considering some fundamental questions. What happens when playing a game? What establishes its boundaries? How do rules appear? Why must we follow them? Who or what is a player? Are they any different from a non-player? And what even is a video game? Now, the answers to these questions may seem common sense, yet I believe it is precisely the commonsensical that most deserves scrutiny. One of the most common sense set of ideas in Western cultures are those of René Descartes, who introduced the notions of subject-object split, mind-body dualism, and the self defined by reason. Now, these ideas are emblematic of humanist thinking, which typically involves seeing knowledge as a product of rational subjects observing objects, distinguishing between mental and physical realms, and viewing the self as an independent agent of reason. And this perspective, which includes a belief in progress in human-centered thinking, informs many game studies approaches. The player is understood as a rational, self-same subject separate from the game. However, this perspective overlooks the complex interplay between various elements involved in gaming. Posthumanism addresses the shortcomings of humanism, and it includes frameworks like new materialism, actor-network theory, object-oriented ontology, assemblage theory, speculative realism, and alien phenomenology. And these frameworks, despite some dissimilarities, generally reject subject-object dualism and the belief in a stable, autonomous self, acknowledging the entanglement of reality, the embodied, the local, the historical, the cultural, and importantly, the technological. Now, posthumanism also critiques humanism for its lack of attention to race and gender, often defaulting to white male perspectives. And this critique extends to the Western-centric nature of canonical humanist thinkers. The posthumanist scholars importantly advocate for a broader intellectual dialogue, including non-Western contributions. So posthumanism has been fruitfully deployed within game studies and has become a very popular framework within the last 5 to 7 years. Scholars have explored what happens when players enter into a relation with the machine, extending their bodies into game worlds, assembling with avatars and digital objects, and also what happens to video games when humans are removed from the situation. This has consequences for identity, affect, embodiment, aesthetics, and ethics. However, despite their innovations, existing posthumanist approaches in game studies often retain elements of humanism, such as viewing technology as a mere extension of the human body or focusing too heavily on human interpretation. And additionally, posthumanist game studies could engage more with the non-Western canon, highlighting the need for a more radical approach. So I propose a post-human theoretical framework for understanding video games inspired by Kyoto School thinker Nishida Kitaro. Nishida's philosophy is inspired equally by Zen Buddhism and Western philosophy, and it rejects subject-object dualism and the fixed nature of entities, including the self. It highlights the interwoven fabric of existence. Nishida's concept of basho, or place, Junsui Keiken, or pure experience, and koiteki chokkan, or action intuition, argue against seeing video games as isolated, definable objects. And this perspective enriches posthumanist game studies, revealing the foundational level where human and machine elements intersect and become distinct. Nishida develops the notion of basho to refer to the foundational human unity that encapsulates dualities such as subject-object, observer-observed, and knower-known. Every relation is placed in a primary basho of experience. The basho is the place from which things can be objectified, but one cannot think of the basho without falling into object logic oneself. One rather experiences the basho in a fully embodied way and knows it through the body prior to the conceptual mind enacting a subject-object split. Cromwell describes the basho as the pre-differentiated unity of reality cum experience, which exists before any split whatever, the foundational place allowing self-consciousness and all knowledge to emerge. Nishida's basho, while influenced by Plato's Kora, reflects different philosophical and religious perspectives. Plato's Kora mediates between ideal truth and material illusion, suggesting a transcendent ontology where true being is eternal. In contrast, Nishida's Basho, inspired by Zen Buddhism, suggests an immanent me ontology, the ontology of non-being. And additionally, unlike Plato, who dealt with the interaction of eternal forms with the impermanent world, Nishida's goal was to transcend dualism, creating a unified field incorporating both the subjective and the objective. And Nishida's viewed the Basho as a logical necessity and conceptualized it as the coexistence and mutual reflection of universals and particulars within entities. Moving away from Aristotelian substantialism, he argued that the predicates rather than subjects mirror universals. For instance, in the statement, red is a color, red exists within the broader universal or basho of color, which encompasses both red and non-red hues, yet does not contain the concept of color itself. Meanwhile, the universal color is also reflected within each individual instance of red. In other words, the basho, the place of color, is the necessary ground for any color to exist at all. Color, as its own particular, meanwhile, will be part of a different, more universal basho. Nishida works through ever-increasing levels of universals, arriving at the place of absolute nothingness. Following this hierarchy, one progresses from existence as being to a domain contained within nothingness. Nishida, influenced by Buddhism, understands true nothing as shunyata, not a void, but the foundation of all existence. And Nishida's Basho holds value for posthumanism, potentially addressing criticism regarding lingering anthropocentrism. Basho transcends Western metaphysical limitations for understanding reality beyond dualist thinking, signifying the foundational ground where experiences are anchored. For Nishida, there is no transcendent eidetic reality where true eternal essences reside, as opposed to the ever-changing illusory phenomenal world of matter. Rather, the phenomenal world is reality as the setting for a relational and inessential codependent origination. Reality is an intradependent field of nothingness, allowing distinction only as self-differentiation, with the self fundamentally different from the ego, not the self as a subject, but the self as the ground of the subject. This philosophy therefore resembles posthumanist approaches focusing on interaction as the condition prior to individuation, in that distinctions arise through relationality rather than existing independently, but it also goes beyond it by providing a more radical approach to entanglement and interaction, suggesting the primordial field from which interaction itself arises, that is, consciousness as a place of nothingness. Nishida's shift from the grammatical subject to the predicate helps us overcome the strict subject-object divide. In game studies, this translates to a shift from video games are to is video game-ing, emphasizing the mutual emergence of subjects and objects from a shared ontological field. Following Nishida, we can question what precedes object formation and move beyond approaches like Adornectric theory, object-oriented ontology, assemblage theory, or alien phenomenology. So it is not enough to say that video games are a coming together of various entities, including human bodies, code, graphics, sounds, bits of plastic, and silicon chips. Nishida would see such description as a series of judgments cleaving a fundamental non-distinct unity. Thinking about video games as networks, as assemblages or arrangements, recognizing the complex nature, is still a type of ontological thinking that assumes a truer, deeper, more eternal reality behind the illusion of the video game as an individual, whole, substantial entity. Nishida instead would invite us not to interrogate what video games are, but to witness that they are. Knowledge of video games in this sense would then involve not their abstraction, but their existence within embodied experience. Asking what are video games remains trapped in object logic, assuming an essence of video games, focusing on what they are rather than witnessing that they are. And this knowledge would rely on intuition, what Nishida calls the logic of contradictory self-identity. Robert Carter describes this as the absolute identification of the is and the is not. So this logic moves from seeing things as self-contained objects, I see a thing, to recognizing no thingness, I see there is no thing, to acknowledging that there is something phenomenally present, actually. So Nishida's logic of contradictory self-identity moves from ontology to meontology, finally recognizing the non-duality of the two and fostering an appreciation for the phenomenal reality of the thing. So, one might say there is no video game. What this means is that video games are events within consciousness, not separate entities. The player in video game manifests as subject and object within the field or the basho of consciousness, which is unified. As identity is constantly emerging and reconstituting itself, this means that the player's identity is fluid, encompassing multiple roles simultaneously within the contradictory self-identity logic: a social being, a player, character. I propose a theory of the basho of the video game as a relational game field. Within this field, human and non-human elements interact and co-determine each other. However, simply listing these elements, as humanist approaches would do, does not surpass object logic. Acknowledging that these elements have no substantial existence outside of their interactions, as done in posthumanist approaches, progresses us past Cartesian views, but we may go further. With Nishida, we shift focus from interaction to the field where these occur, the basho of the video game. The video game is seen then as the primary context for the emergence of players and other entities, allowing gameplay subjectivity and objectivity to emerge. We apprehend gameplay as an event within consciousness, a pure act of intuition, resonating with Nishida's concept of pure experience. Now, in later works, Nishida identifies basho with the historical world, where individuals are shaped by and shape their environment through a dialectical relation of action-intuition. This dialectical relation means we shape and are shaped by the world through creating actions enabled by technology. Technology extending the body is pivotal in action intuition, merging self and environment. And our bodies are entwined with the world, with individual actions being part of the world's broader activity. Nishida views the historical body as a creative force that acts on its environment. And in true post-human fashion, he states that the human body must be technological. So I apply what discussed until now by looking at Jetpack Joyride, whose gameplay involves intuitive experience akin to Nishida's pure experience, where action flows without conscious deliberation. Jetpack Joyride is a 2D mobile game of the infinite runner genre. The player controls Barry Steak Fries, who breaks into a secret laboratory to commandeer a machine gun jetpack hybrid, running and flying through the laboratory, collecting coins, avoiding obstacles, and obtaining power-ups. When playing, individuals enter a basho understood as a context setting the parameters for meaning, that is, a world. Within this basho, the smartphone becomes a means of projecting intentionally within a digital space. Now, approached through object logic, the digital space is just pixels, code, electrical signals. But within the basho of Jetpack Joyride, it becomes a navigable space. Numbers are not just abstract digits, but become scores, measuring player performance. Within this basho, players incorporate tools and technologies, both hardware, smartphones, headphones, perhaps glasses, and software. So Barry Steak Fries becomes an extension of the player's intentional acts. These incorporations modify the environment, which modifies them in return. For example, coins picked up during the game can be used to purchase gadgets, character skins, and power-ups, and these bonuses might impact the perceived possible actions. The gameplay involves simple controls, but is challenging to master. Novices may struggle with the game's rhythm, determining precise moments to ascend and descend as to avoid obstacles, especially as the game speeds up and obstacles become more frequent. But with practice, players move from beyond conscious timing to a more intuitive experience defined by feeling rather than conceptual thinking. And this state is akin to Nishida's pure experience, where action flows without conscious deliberation. Now, we may compare pure experience to what is typically referred to as flow in game studies. Flow, as described by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, is an engrossed state balancing challenge and skill, marked by concentration, merged action, and awareness, and a loss of self-consciousness, a feeling of control, and an altered sense of time. Players describe it often as being in the zone. Now, Nishida parallels this, describing a state where an incomprehensible power beyond the self functions alone, without consciousness of the self. But Csikszentmihalyi defines flow as a subjective state, while pure experience precedes subjectivity. It is the true union of subject and object, as Nishida describes it. In pure experience, the basho therefore plays itself. It is not the player that plays the game, but the game plays itself. Action unfolds effortlessly and feels right without the need for conscious deliberation. In pure experience, players are not divided into subject and object yet. The game world and its components are not seen as distinct objects either. Now, subsequent splits might occur. For example, encountering an obstacle might prompt a reflective strategy, or a notification might shift the device's role from gaming to communication. But moments of self-conscious awareness or self-conscious reflection, however, differ from the direct knowing of pure experience, and they focus on that the game is rather than what and how it is. Thank you very much for listening.